Hollywood made you believe the gold rush was a wild adventure. Men striking it rich, saloons full of laughter, and fortunes made overnight. But the truth is that the gold rush claim was closer to a nightmare. Disease ran rampant, crime was the norm, and instead of gold, most people found misery. In this video, we are going to show you the 10 biggest myths about the gold rush and show you why life in the Wild West was absolute hell. So stick around till the end to hear the shocking truth about how boomtowns become death traps. But before we start, if you love uncovering these facts about the Old West, kindly click on that subscribe button and support this channel. Your support will encourage us to dig deeper into the real stories behind the legends. Now sit tight as we bring you these mind-blowing myths to reality. Everyone struck it rich. Now let's start with the biggest lie, that striking gold was just a matter of effort. In reality, the odds were stacked brutally against you. While a few lucky prospectors got rich early on, the vast majority arrived too late. The rivers had already been picked clean. By 1852, easily accessible gold was gone. What was left required equipment, manpower, and capital, things most desperate men didn't have. They worked 14-hour days in mud and freezing water, hoping for flecks of gold that barely bought food. Thousands left in worse shape than they came, sick, broke, or dead. Many couldn't even afford the trip back home. So the promise of gold was the bait. The trap was the reality. Brutal labor, dwindling hope, and financial ruin. And if you are excited at the first fact, then stick around for the full gist because it gets even more better. Gold towns were glamorous. Now Hollywood often paints the gold rush towns as thrilling hubs of adventure, alive with music, dancing, clinking whiskey glasses, and high-stakes poker games. But that romantic image couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, most gold towns were hastily thrown together, ramshackle settlements with no real planning or infrastructure. These weren't towns. They were chaotic clusters of tents and wooden shacks, lacking even the most basic necessities. So forget glamour. There were no sewage systems, no clean water, and no sanitation. Rivers quickly became contaminated with human waste and rotting animal carcasses. Diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid spread like wildfire, claiming more lives than bullets ever did. Medical care was either primitive or entirely absent. A broken bone or infected cut could turn fatal within days. Now here's the kicker. Despite these hellish conditions, the cost of living was sky high. With supply chains struggling to keep up, merchants cashed in on desperation. A single egg might cost the modern equivalent of $30, and basic goods like flour or coffee were luxuries. Greed wasn't just found in the mines, it was baked into every aspect of life. And if disease didn't get you, the danger on the streets just might. These towns were filled with angry, exhausted men, many armed and looking for a fight. Law enforcement was either corrupt, underfunded, or non-existent. Violence was a daily occurrence. The truth? Life in a gold rush town was less Wild West fantasy. Law and order ruled the West. We have all seen the iconic Westerns movies where the brave sheriff with a tin star, standing tall against outlaws, restoring justice with a steely glare and a six-shooter. But in the real gold rush era, that image is pure fiction. Most mining camps and boomtowns had no functioning legal system at all. There were no judges, no police forces, and certainly no due process. These towns exploded in size overnight, and any semblance of order was quickly drowned in greed, desperation, and violence. Disputes over gold claims were frequent, and without legal channels, they often ended in gunfights. If someone stole your claim or encroached on your territory, there was no court to appeal to, only your gun. In some towns, vigilante courts emerged, but these weren't symbols of justice. They were mobs, angry, lawless groups who handed out brutal punishment on suspicion alone. Lynchings were common. It didn't matter if you were guilty or innocent. Upsetting the wrong person could mean death by nightfall. A whole lot of people were wanted. Corruption was rampant. Gold ruled everything, and those who had it could buy loyalty, security, or revenge. Bribes, intimidation, and hired guns kept power in the hands of the wealthy. Honest miners carried weapons not to start fights, but simply to survive the lawless environment. So the idea that the Wild West was ruled by honor and justice is one of Hollywood's greatest myths. In reality, it was a bloody free-for-all where law was written at the end of a barrel and erased just as quickly. Now this is the part you don't want to miss out. Hard work was always rewarded. Now we have all heard the old saying, if you work hard, you'll succeed. It's the backbone of the American dream. But during the gold rush, that dream turned into a nightmare for thousands. The truth is, hard work rarely translates into success, and more often than not, it gets you nowhere. At first, the earliest prospectors, the so-called 49ers, did strike it rich. But once news spread, the goldfields were overwhelmed with hopefuls from around the world. Claims became scarce, competition was brutal, and the easily accessible gold was quickly depleted. Then came the corporations. Backed by wealthy investors, these industrial mining outfits brought in steam-powered machines, hydraulic hoses that leveled hillsides, and private security to guard their interests. They could process tons of earth in a day, something a lone miner with a pan could never compete with. Small-time miners were squeezed out, bullied, or outright evicted. Many were forced to sell their claims for pennies, while others had theirs stolen without a shred of legal protection. There was no justice for the poor. The system favored those with deep pockets and political pull. Working hard didn't mean you'd strike gold. It meant you'd break your back, only to watch someone richer take it all. In a land supposedly built on opportunity, the deck was stacked. For most, the only thing the gold rush guaranteed was exhaustion, disappointment, and a bitter realization. The dream was a lie. Saloons were fun social hubs. Another important fact you should know is that Hollywood loves to glamorize the frontier saloon, swinging doors, lively piano music, flirtatious barmaids, and charismatic gunslingers. But the real saloons of the gold rush era were far darker, far more brutal, and far less romantic. What happens next week will shock you. These establishments weren't centers of community. They were traps. Miners, often exhausted and lonely, flocked to them after long days of grueling labor, only to blow their hard-earned gold dust on overpriced whiskey, crooked card games, and fleeting company. Alcohol was cheap in quality, but steep in price, and it flowed freely. Addictions formed fast, and fortunes disappeared overnight. Violence was a nightly ritual. Fistfights, stabbings, and shootings weren't the exception. They were the rule. With no law enforcement, no bouncers, and no consequences, saloons became breeding grounds for chaos. A losing hand at poker could quickly escalate into bloodshed. And in towns without hospitals, a knife wound often meant a slow, agonizing death. Now you might be wondering, what about the women? Well, far from the playful, confident bartenders shown on screen, many were exploited. Some worked under harsh conditions for little to no pay. Others were victims of trafficking, forced into servitude with no escape. Their lives were consumed by abuse, addiction, and despair. So the truth is, saloons were less about leisure and more about survival. Dark, dangerous places where men and women spiraled into ruin. For many, the saloon wasn't a night out. It was the beginning of the end. And that takes us to the most shocking. Stay tuned. Native Americans were the aggressors. Now, we have been fed a familiar story. Brave settlers under constant attack by hostile native tribes, forced to defend themselves in the name of progress. But this version of history turns reality upside down. During the gold rush, it wasn't Native Americans who were the aggressors. It was the settlers, miners, and state-backed militias who brought violence and destruction to indigenous lands. So as gold fever spread, thousands of miners poured into California and beyond, trampling over sacred territories, poisoning rivers with mercury and waste, and obliterating traditional hunting and fishing grounds. They didn't ask, they took. Entire native communities were uprooted, displaced, or wiped out completely. Diseases brought by newcomers decimated populations that had no immunity, while food sources were overhunted or destroyed. And here comes a twist. When we consider the violence, it wasn't random, it was state-sponsored. In California, the government actively funded armed militias to carry out brutal campaigns of extermination. Bounties were paid for native scalps. Some local governments even reimbursed citizens for bullets used in so-called defensive raids. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic efforts to erase indigenous presence from the land. Thousands of native men, women, and children were slaughtered under the guise of protecting settlers. In reality, they were defending their homes, their way of life, and their very existence. The gold rush didn't just bring settlers and shovels. It brought one of the darkest chapters in American history. The real aggressors weren't indigenous people. They were the ones chasing gold at any cost. Women had it easy as barmaids or wives. The romanticized image of women in gold rush towns dressed in lace, waving fans, and charming rugged cowboys is a complete fabrication. The reality was far more brutal. Women didn't stroll through saloons with flirtatious smiles. They endured some of the harshest conditions of the era, often with no support, no protection, and no way out. With men vastly outnumbering women, those who did arrive were seen less as individuals and more as commodities. Many were lured to mining towns with false promises of jobs or marriage, only to find themselves trapped in a cycle of exploitation and abuse. Sex work, often coerced or forced, became the only means of survival for some. In these unsanitary, violent environments, sexually transmitted diseases and physical assaults were rampant. There were no doctors, no legal rights, and no protection. Even those who arrived as wives didn't fare much better. They lived in filthy shanties, cooked over open flames in extreme conditions, and faced the constant threat of disease. Many buried their children before they reached age 5. Isolation was severe. Weeks or months might pass without seeing another woman. Domestic abuse was widespread, and with no functioning law enforcement or social services, women had no recourse. Their suffering was often invisible and ignored. Forget the Hollywood fantasy of spirited frontier women holding their own. Most women in gold rush towns weren't living, they were surviving day by day in a world designed to break them. Here's the most astonishing part of the whole story. Miners were rough but noble. Now we have come to love the image of the rugged prospector, dusty hat, pickaxe in hand, chasing the American dream with grit and honesty. It's a comforting picture, but it's not the truth. The real miners of the gold rush weren't all brave adventurers, fueled by hope. Many were far from noble. A significant number of miners weren't seeking opportunities. They were fleeing consequences. Criminals, debt dodgers, army deserters, and con artists flocked to the West, hoping to outrun their pasts and strike it rich. With no background checks and no law enforcement, the gold rush was a perfect cover for those who wanted to disappear or exploit others. Violence and theft were common. Claim jumping, stealing someone's hard-earned gold spot, was a daily threat. If a miner found gold and left it unattended for even a moment, someone else might take over and kill to keep it. There were no reliable courts to settle disputes. Whoever had the most muscles or bullets usually won. As a matter of fact, scams were just as prevalent. Salted claims, fake gold deposits created by sprinkling flakes into worthless land, were sold to desperate newcomers. These frauds turned dreams into financial ruin overnight. Fake mining tools, worthless maps, and bogus gold-detecting devices were sold in droves. So the idea of a tight-knit, honorable brotherhood of miners is a myth. The real story is darker, one of desperation, deception, and survival. The gold rush didn't bring out the best in people. For many, it brought out their worst, but that's not all. The gold rush united Americans. We often hear that the gold rush was a grand unifying chapter in American history, a time when people of all backgrounds came together in search of prosperity. But peel back the myth, and the truth is far more troubling. The gold rush didn't unite, it divided. It deepened racial hatred, fueled xenophobia, and institutionalized discrimination in the name of profit. So as the gold fields filled with hopeful miners from across the globe, Chinese laborers, Mexican vaqueros, African Americans, and European immigrants, tensions exploded. White settlers, feeling threatened by competition, turned their anger toward anyone who looked or spoke differently. The government wasn't neutral, it was complicit. California passed openly racist laws like the foreign miners tax, designed specifically to drive out Chinese miners by financially crippling them. So the next thing that followed was mob violence. Armed gangs attacked immigrant miners, stole their claims, destroyed their camps, and in many cases, murdered them. Chinese and Mexican workers were frequent targets of lynching and public beatings. Black freedmen who fled the post-slavery South, hoping for a better future, found themselves staring down the barrel of the same old hatred in a new frontier. Some mining camps posted signs flat out banning non-white laborers. Justice, when it came, was handed out by mobs, white ones, and the law looked the other way. Rather than forging unity, the gold rush exposed and amplified the fractures in American society. Far from a melting pot, it was a racial powder keg, and gold was the spark that set it off. Here is the part you don't want to miss. The gold rush built great American cities. Yes, cities like San Francisco grew, but they were the exception. Most gold towns collapsed as fast as they rose. These boom towns existed only as long as gold flowed. Once it dried up, the population vanished. Businesses shuttered. Crime spiked. Many towns were abandoned overnight. Others were destroyed by fire, looted, or left to rot in the dust. So the dream of permanent wealth and community was a mirage. Suicide, addiction, and ruin followed the gold's disappearance. What remained were ghost towns, monuments to greed, desperation, and false promises. The gold rush didn't build a nation. It nearly broke one. The gold rush wasn't a golden opportunity, it was a desperate gamble. For most, it meant sickness, violence, and betrayal. Behind every glimmering nugget was a mountain of suffering. Hollywood turned it into a legend, but the truth, it was hell. The people who lived there didn't find fortune. They found fever, failure, and forgotten graves. So next time you hear, "There's gold in them hills," remember what it really cost. Because the gold rush didn't make America rich, it made it bleed. But before we go, which of these myths shocked you the most? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.